Hello, this is Dr. Grande. Today I will analyze the case of Corey Christensen and Thomas Davy. First I'll look at the background of this case, including the timeline of the incident, then offer my analysis. Corey James Christensen was born on January 30, 1981, and lived in Townsville, Queensland, Australia. In 2005, he became romantically involved with a woman named Jay. They went on to have 3 sons and married in 2015. Corey worked for a company called Sun Metals, just outside Townsville. On Sunday, September 30, 2018, Corey and his wife Jay were visiting Alva Beach, 65 miles east of their home. This is a small, quiet coastal community that people often visit for fishing and boating. Corey met up with a friend of his named Louis Bengoa, who he had known since 1994. The men used a Polaris ATV to drive around the area. This brings me to another key player in the story. Thomas Ian Davy was born on December 20, 1990, and lived in Cairns. He worked as a structural engineer in the aviation industry. In July 2018, he started dating a woman named Candace. On September 30, 2018, Thomas and Candace drove to Alva Beach. They spent some time fishing and consuming alcohol. At about 6 p.m., Thomas and Candace were approached by Corey and Louis. Thomas and Candace had never met either man. They were strangers. All 4 individuals talked for about 15 minutes. Corey invited them to join a party to celebrate the National Rugby League Grand Final. The party was being held on a vacant lot near the house of Corey's father. Thomas and Candace drove to the party, arriving at around the time the game was starting. The couple continued to drink alcohol and became intoxicated. Halfway through the game, Thomas became upset with Candace's behavior. He wanted both of them to leave the party, but Candace refused. Louis told Thomas that Candace was welcome to stay. At 9:39 p.m., Thomas left the party alone in his Toyota Land Cruiser. At around 10 p.m., Thomas returned to the party and once again asked Candace to leave with him, but she refused. He left, but he parked his vehicle just a short distance away. Sometime between 10:30 and 11:30 p.m., Corey, Louis, and Candace climbed in the Polaris ATV because Candace asked Louis to take her for a ride. As they were riding in the vehicle, Candace somehow fell out and dislocated her shoulder. She would later tell 5 different stories about what happened. There is no way to know which one is true, or if any of them are true. In one story, she claimed that Louis pushed her out of the Polaris. Louis had a different story. He said that Candace fell out on her own while doing an impression of the character Rose from the movie Titanic, like Candace was standing up with her arms out to the side. Either way, Louis returned to the party alone because Candace hid from him. So when she exited the Polaris, she hid in the area and Louis could not find her. He had a conversation with Corey and they left the party together in the Polaris to search for Candace. When the men found Candace, she climbed back into the vehicle. She claimed that the men were making jokes about her shoulder, which made her uncomfortable because she did not believe they would help her get medical attention. She told them to stop the vehicle. She exited the Polaris, then walked to the first house she could see. This house was on Topton Street and was occupied by a 19-year-old man named Dean Weber. He was asleep when Candace knocked on his door. She told them she had been with a couple of men she just met. She fell out of a buggy and needed an ambulance, but they would not call one. Dean let her into his house. This was at 12:23 a.m., now on October 1, 2018. 3 minutes later, at 12:26 a.m., Dean called 000, the emergency services number in Australia. He explained that an injured lady knocked on his door asking for help. A few minutes later, Corey and Louis approached Dean's house. They yelled, banged on the door, and called out Candace's name. Dean turned off the lights, locked his door, and told the men to leave his property. He was still on the phone with emergency services as this was happening. At 12:31 a.m., Dean could be heard saying, quote, "Look, mate, can you go? Get off me property, mate. Get off me property. Can you get off my property?" Unquote. The operator asked if Dean felt safe. He responded, "No, I'm not safe." Dean was told to call emergency services again if there was any change in the circumstances, and the call was terminated. Corey and Louis left the property, made contact with Thomas, and all 3 men returned to Dean's house. It is not clear what information Thomas was given by Corey and Louie. The truth was that Candace went to Dean's house looking for help, but Thomas may have been told that Candace was in some sort of trouble and needed to be rescued. At 12:39 a.m., Dean sent a text message to a friend which read, "I'm about to die. Holy blank. I don't know what to do." At 12:42 a.m., a constable called Dean and told him he should be there within 30 minutes. The police response time in the area was not exactly blazing fast. It was less like, "We'll be right there," and more like, "We'll be there eventually." At 12:51 a.m., Dean made a second call to 000, which was answered by a senior constable named Luke Weeks. Dean said the men were now trying to make entry into his house. Again, at this point, Corey, Louie, and Thomas were at Dean's house. Dean put Candace on the phone, and she tried to explain what was going on. Inexplicably, Luke became hostile and said, quote, "Someone's telling me bull-blank stories here, between you and the other guy. Someone stop lying and tell me what's going on," unquote. He then said, quote, "You've already spoken so much blank to me, though, and then you do. Turns out you do know them," unquote. Just before Luke terminated the call, at 12:56 a.m., Candace could be heard screaming. At this moment, Corey and Thomas made entry into Dean's house through the sliding glass door by lifting the door off its track. It's not exactly clear what Louie did. It appears as though he remained outside. Dean was not sure if 2 or 3 men entered his house. While Corey Christensen was just inside the door of the house, Dean stabbed him with a knife he retrieved for self-defense. Corey may have physically struck Dean right before being stabbed. After being stabbed, Corey exited the house, mortally wounded. At this point, Thomas struck Dean repeatedly. Dean stabbed him as well, and Thomas exited the house, mortally wounded. At 12:58 a.m., Thomas Davy called 000. He was unable to communicate anything other than the fact that he was at Alva Beach. Right after this, he collapsed outside the house. 1 minute later, Dean Weber called 000 for a third time. He indicated that he just stabbed a bloke who broke into his house, and he thought he killed him. He said, quote, "The other guy's going to kill me. I don't want to die," unquote. Police and paramedics arrived at the scene at 1:16 a.m., 50 minutes after Dean first called 000. 37-year-old Corey Christensen had sustained 2 stab wounds. His blood alcohol level was 0.21%. 27-year-old Thomas Davy had been stabbed 6 times. His blood alcohol level was a staggering 0.53%. Anything above 0.5% is generally considered potentially fatal. Both men were pronounced dead at the scene. 29-year-old Candace was transported to a hospital and treated for her shoulder injury. Dean Weber had bruises on his head, face, and limbs. The knife he used was found on a table in his house. After conducting an investigation, the police determined that Dean killed Corey and Thomas in self-defense. A coronial inquest was held. The deputy coroner referred the case to the director of public prosecutions because there was a suspicion based on reasonable grounds that Dean committed an indictable offense. The director of public prosecutions decided not to prosecute Dean, saying that a charge of murder would have no reasonable prospect of success. Now moving to my analysis. Dean Weber maintains his innocence, and he was never prosecuted for any crime. In theory, if new evidence were to become available, he could be charged. Some people, including family members of the 2 men who were killed, believe that Dean may have engaged in wrongdoing, like he may have been guilty of murder or manslaughter. In Australia, the right to defend oneself is limited as compared to the United States. In the U.S., an individual is protected by the Castle Doctrine, various standard ground laws, pretrial immunity hearings, and civil immunity. If a homeowner kills a man who intruded into his house, there is no concern about using the correct amount of force. Lethal force is presumed to be justified. The police in the U.S. often close a home invasion self-defense case on the same day if there is evidence of forced entry and immediate danger. In Australia, a homeowner claiming self-defense must show that his response was reasonable and proportionate, and lethal force was the only option he had available to protect himself. A homeowner effectively has a duty to retreat even inside his own house if escape is reasonably possible. Proportionality is a critical requirement. The homeowner can only use as much force as necessary to protect himself. lethal force is not presumed to be justified. If he uses too much force, he could be guilty of murder or manslaughter. This brings me to the question, was Dean Weber guilty of any crime related to the deaths of Corey Christensen and Thomas Davy? Let's take a look at the evidence both for and against the idea that he was guilty, starting with the inculpatory factors. There is no question that Dean stabbed Corey and Thomas to death in his house. Dean said he could not identify the men, and he did not adequately supply the details of the stabbing. It was more like he had a knife in his hand, the men entered, something happened, and they died. His account was not thorough or complete. Killing two people with a knife is pretty difficult. It is not something that would typically happen by randomly swinging a knife near targets one cannot see. Corey and Thomas were described as upstanding citizens in their community. They were not known to be violent. Now moving to the exculpatory factors, Dean Weber was pulled into the situation by Candace. She went to his house and imposed on him. He was an innocent bystander who had nothing to do with her alcohol consumption or any of her behavior. Dean was asleep when she knocked on his door. Candace was injured and requested help. Dean immediately called 000. He made it clear that assistance was required. The situation was an emergency. After the men arrived at his house, Dean said that he did not feel safe. Dean locked his door and told the men to get off his property. At no point did he exit his house and become the aggressor. He did everything possible to avoid a physical confrontation. Corey and Thomas forced entry into Dean's house. Any reasonable homeowner would be fearful under those circumstances. Thomas, and possibly Corey, physically struck Dean during the confrontation. Dean used a knife to defend himself against the aggressors. After stabbing them, he did not pursue them outside. Rather, he put the knife down on a table. When considering all the evidence in this case, do I believe that Dean Weber is guilty of any crime? No. In my opinion, he is completely innocent. Dean acted in self-defense. Family members of the men who died are understandably upset by the loss, but it is ridiculous to suggest that Dean committed any type of offense. There is no significant evidence to support that claim. What do I think happened in this case? This is just a theory, my opinion. Corey, Louie, Thomas, and Candace consumed alcohol and became intoxicated. When Candace fell out of the Polaris ATV, Louie became nervous because he had been drinking. He should not have been operating any type of vehicle. Louie was hoping the entire situation would be resolved quietly and without the involvement of any police officers. Corey and Louie went to Dean's house to get Candace, but she refused to exit. This is when they approached Thomas and requested assistance. Thomas may have been led to believe that Candace was in danger. Instead of calling the police, he acted impulsively and broke into Dean's house with Corey's help. Severe intoxication may have played a part in the decision made by Thomas. Corey's motive is less clear. It's possible he also believed that Candace was in danger. One could make an argument that, in a limited sense, Corey and Thomas were victims of this situation as well. They may not have been working with accurate information, and they falsely believed their actions were justified because they were protecting Candace. In contrast, Dean's actions were unequivocally justified. He was actually defending both himself and Candace from an immediate and violent threat. The real question in this case is, how did Corey and Thomas obtain inaccurate information, if that is in fact what happened? Louie and Candace were not credible witnesses, so the truth may never be known. Now moving to my final thoughts. Whatever caused the chaotic behavior of the four intoxicated individuals in this story, one thing is for certain, Dean Weber had no role in creating it. He was pulled into their nonsense, physically attacked, and ultimately forced to defend himself. This case underscores the importance of collecting accurate information and exercising sound judgment before taking drastic steps, such as breaking into someone's house. It also serves as a cautionary tale about the risks created by self-defense laws that can expose innocent people to prosecution, and about a police force that takes 50 minutes to respond to a home invasion. Those are my thoughts in the case of Corey Christensen and Thomas Davy. Thank you so much for watching. I'll talk to you soon.